A handout just to kind of give you an idea of the way I'm going to do the talk today. In order to understand Henry Montgomery and the way the Shankill Road mission came about, I think you have to understand what was going on in Belfast at this time, in late Victorian Belfast, the reason why the Shankill Road mission was established. So my plan is to give a bit of a background of what was going on in Belfast at this time, move on to Henry Montgomery. Who was he? His time at Albert Street Presbyterian Church, that's where he started off, just across around with the old pound area, around that way. And then how he came to establish the Shankill Road mission, tell you a bit about how it developed, and that should take me up to about the half an hour period. Is that okay? And I should say, actually, the paper I'm using this from today, I'm hoping to get published, and so if you have any feedback, that would be quite helpful. So, as I was saying, the historian Patrick Buckland, quite a famous historian in Belfast, he has argued that during the 19th century, Belfast was a typical English industrial rather than an Irish town. Similarly, there was a French writer that came to Belfast during 1911. He was, as I say, a French writer called Paul Duquois, and he gave this description of Belfast: with its red bricked and smoke blackened buildings after the American pattern, its factories and its palaces, this workers' city resembles Liverpool or Glasgow rather than an Irish town. And I think this argument that's made by both comes from the fact that Belfast faced remarkable industrial growth in the city across this period for its engineering, linen and shipbuilding industries, and thus became an urban centre that merged such cities as Leeds, Manchester and Glasgow, as opposed to the rest of Ireland that remained predominantly rural based. And the growth of these industries resulted in an influx of people from rural Ulster, mainly down in Antrim, which had a striking effect on the population figures. For example, and I think I gave you the population figures there just to see. In 1801, the population of Belfast was 19,000. By 1851, it was near 88,000. But by 1901, it was 350,000 people in Belfast. And with this rapid growth, the physical size of Belfast also developed, and one example of this was the Shankill Road. I probably don't need to tell you as much about the history of the Shankill, but by about 1890, the population stood at about 30,000 people. And as part of the reason this developed was because of the linen mills and the fact that there was prime area for building for the working classes to come in during the 1860s and 1870s. And obviously one of the most famous examples would be Urd's Mill. This rapid urban growth meant that the main religious denominations of Belfast had to expand in order to meet the demand of their respective flocks. And it's been noted that during this period, for Belfast, this was arguably the greatest church building period in its history. In terms of examples, I would say the Church of Ireland, in around 1850, it started off with about 8 churches and a membership of 30,000. During the next 40 years, they built another 16 churches. And then obviously you had St Anne's Cathedral. During the same period, the Presbyterians started with 20 churches, and they ended up with 47 by the end. And the Roman Catholic Church, in particular, at this period, it really grew. It had 5 churches out by the 1860, and by the end, there was just over 85,000 Catholics in the city. Yet the point that we made here is that whilst the church provision attended might have become universal amongst the middle classes, there was a problem when it came to the working classes. A lot of them weren't attending. And in many cases, it was those in non-church going that were the victims of the less pleasant sides of urban growth. I think sometimes we forget this, and as much as Belfast experienced great, remarkable industrial growth, and it became a city known all across the world, there was problems when it came to the problems that come with urban growth. For example, bringing so many people into a city all at once, it's going to have problems in terms of poverty. And the issues that developed here was you had issues of drunkenness, crime, etc. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that the church had a role of ensuring discipline and moral discipline in rural areas, but whenever they lost track of their people when they come into the city, these problems developed. And therefore it's within this context that you can start to understand how Henry Montgomery's career developed, this idea of industrial Belfast. The good side of it, certainly, but there's also a bad side, and he's seeking to address that. If I can turn on now to Henry Montgomery himself. Henry Montgomery was born in Bangor in 1897 into what he described as godly parentage. He came from a very religious background. His own religious awakening came during the 1859 revival, which I'm sure some of you are probably aware of, this period of heightened religiosity. And I think there was about 100,000 converts to Protestantism at this time. And this was also a time when you might have heard of evangelicalism, a real stricter, more intense form of Protestantism that put an emphasis upon the individual's personal experience with God. This is all important because this is what he would be doing at the Shankill Road Mission a few years later. I should say that he didn't immediately go into ministry, but actually started off a business career, and this is also important when you think of the mission. He wasn't just a minister. He had seen a bit of the world and understood the way things worked. But Montgomery first became involved in evangelical home mission work, as in going outside the church and helping people on the streets in Belfast during the 1870s, when he helped a Presbyterian minister in Belfast, in the centre of Belfast, who offered him a position as a missionary in one of the Belfast town mission halls. And I should say the Belfast Town Mission would be better known today as the Belfast City Mission. It started off in 1827 as a non-denominational mission that was for all the churches, but by the end the Presbyterian Church took it over. Montgomery proceeded to enrol at Queen's University, but whilst he was there he also kept on his missionary work in the city, which a lot of them wouldn't have had the time to do, but he continued it. And soon after graduating from Queen's, he moved to Albert Street Presbyterian Church in August 1882, where he began what has been described as a singularly successful ministry of 20 years. It was very successful, the work he did over there. This church was established in 1852, and it originated from the work of the Belfast Town Mission. So you're starting to see, there's a bit of a correlation developing here. Anything he does within the Presbyterian Church, it's linked to mission work. And as I say, I think for most of you know where the Albert Street would be over that side of town. So during his time at Albert Street, the congregation increased from 160 families to over 750. That tells you a lot about the work he was doing. And whilst this congregation had previously been part of the town mission during the 1850s, missionary work, whilst Montgomery was there, remained an important part of its outlook. For example, the congregation report for 1890 highlighted that evangelism and activism were key components of the church's ethos. I just have this quote, which I think is quite good. I came across this actually quite recently. It is the business of the Church of God to make inroads upon the kingdom of darkness. We have a large band of Christian workers who are engaged in various forms of aggressive activities. Open-air meetings, cottage meetings, tract distribution and visitation are carried on by them all. So that gives you an idea, the kind of work. This is going beyond the church setting. This shows clearly that whilst Montgomery's ministry at Albert Street was very successful in terms of increasing his own congregation, he continued to promote his interest in mission work and helping those who were outside the church. Interestingly, this has not gone unnoticed beyond Ireland because his services and skills were in great demand. Montgomery's known all across the British Isles at this time. The best example of this was a call from Trinity Free Church in Glasgow, which was signed by over 1,000 people, requesting that Montgomery become their new minister. This is the point. Montgomery was very popular, and actually Albert Street didn't take kindly to this idea. They're trying to poach their minister. Glasgow just sent in this report saying, how we've prayed and God's telling us that Montgomery is the man for us. And Albert Street just said, no, you aren't having him. This is how much they valued this man. The decision to establish the Shankill Road Mission now, I'm on this, so I would be on the bottom of page 2 here. So the decision to establish the Shankill Road Mission in 1896 emanated from what Montgomery witnessed a few years previously during an unplanned walk from the centre of Belfast to his church in the west of the city, obviously the Shankill Road. He recalled how, and this is a very famous speech, one Sunday evening during the hour of the regular church services, I walked from Royal Avenue to the Shankill Road. I was so struck by the large numbers of non-church-going people that my heart was moved in a strange degree to reach them with the message of life. And after this, he says that he proceeded to bring his congregation to Albert Street. He walked them from Albert Street down to the Shankill Road, where they held an open-air service. Now, how much truth is in this story, I'm not too sure, because I've always thought to myself, surely in the hour of the church service he should be in Albert Street. So I don't know where, but I think the point isn't, whether it's more whether he's sentimentalising what happened, or maybe even playing the crowd. But it's the point that it does show his genuine concern about the effects of urbanisation on morality and religion. For him, the growth of Belfast was great, but whenever he came to Shankill Road, he saw the problems of it. This was a place that was being left behind. And I should also say that on previous occasions he had been quite outspoken And he was very angry that the middle classes in the rich in Belfast weren't doing enough to help the people in the Shankill. For example, when he chaired a meeting of the Belfast Town Mission a few years previously, he made an important speech which was actually reported all across the UK because it was quite controversial, where he lamented the lack of funds that were available to the mission and proceeded to criticise the wealthy individuals of the town for ignoring the religious needs of the growing population. He said, "I cannot help noticing the fact that recently there's been a great increase in the provisions for the entertainment of the people. A new circus setting, I believe, accommodating 4,000. That was actually the Grand Opera House that was just being opened. And a new theatre accommodating 1,500, when in addition plans have been passed by the corporation for still another theatre, seating perhaps 1,000 people. Facts like these, no Christian minister in the city can afford to ignore, as showing the trend of taste in the community, and moreover, as marking the great increase in the population and consequently increased necessity for evangelistic effort in reaching a large portion of the industrial classes." The point, once again, here is Montgomery, an evangelical minister, but also, and I don't think Jack would mind me saying, that Presbyterian ministers in these days were very much the opposite. If you had time to play, you had time to pray. So this idea that, the middle classes are happy pouring money into opera houses and theatres, but whilst they're not willing to help people in the Shankill that aren't going to church and that are suffering. He concluded his speech with this line, which I think is absolutely fantastic. With regard to the problem of the masses, all I can say is that if we don't reach the masses will reach us, and in a way some may not like. It was almost a threat. He was clearly raising the possibility of class 4. Essentially, he was saying if we don't get these in church going, which would be working class in control, if we let them continue doing what they're doing, or in his view, by not going to church, they were getting involved in trouble, crime, etc. He said this could cause problems for the citizens of Belfast. Of course, I think it's important not to push that too far. I don't think Montgomery was interested in helping the people of Shankill just for his own, because he was worried about somehow there was going to be some kind of class warfare. I think he was just using it as a threat to those that really needed that kind of, that push. Coming back to his walk up the Shankill Road that day, in response to what Montgomery saw that evening, he consulted with his congregation, and it was agreed in the spring of 1896 that they would purchase a plot of land, as you know, where it is today, Carlow Street on Shankill, where it meets the Shankill Road, and set about securing private donations for the erection of mission buildings that would seek to help those that were most in need. In the short term, however, because obviously it would take a few years to build this, to build the mission hall, the mission building, because this was 1896, the buildings wouldn't open for nearly 2 years later, November 1898. So in the short term, he set about erecting a tent where the Shankill mission building would be today. He set up a tent, and for 7 weeks during the summer, there were services held every evening, which were preceded by open-air services. It started off in the summer, and the idea is it would run for 7 weeks. It ended up running right into the winter. And there had been a problem where, there was this great story in the newspaper where the tent blew down, so they ended up having to build a wooden structure. So this was how popular it was. At the first tent meeting, Montgomery explained that the services now being held were for the purpose of seeking and saving the lost through the preaching of the gospel. And he said these meetings were directed at men and women who have no church connection and who have been practically left without God and without hope in the world. No one else is doing this in Belfast at this time. This is great stuff. No one else is doing this. Furthermore, at these gatherings, they also tackled the most common problem that affected the working class areas, namely the so-called demon drink. One newspaper referred to it as, it's a great line, an object lesson as to the results of the bottle and the barrel. And whilst the mission was clearly aimed at helping both men and women, it took a real focus on men. And one of the more interesting things that Montgomery did during this tent campaign, he went out in the evenings, and when men were coming out of the bars at 9:30, he would actually get into the bars and pulling them out, trying to preach to them there. And this is a key point as well. This is dangerous stuff. And these days, he's going about, whereas, let's be honest, some areas are quite rough. He's getting into bars where men are intoxicated, and there is stories of, some of his helpers are getting punched and all, this is quite what it is. But he continues with it. So he's certainly not your ordinary minister that stays in the church and has no interest in what's going on outside. He's pragmatic, and he's willing to get his hands dirty. That's what you could say. More broadly, this tent campaign highlights that Montgomery and his fellow mission workers were focused on preaching the gospel to those who were outside the churches and perceived in a state of moral destitution. Furthermore, the fact these men and women felt comfortable coming to a tent, but not a regular church building, suggests that the issue of respectability is quite important here. I think this is something Montgomery was quite good at. He realised that it's not the problem of these non-church going. He felt it was his responsibility. Why is it these people don't feel comfortable coming into the church setting? A lot of this does have to do with respectability. They haven't got the proper dress. For example, a lady going to church, you would be expected to wear the hat. He's happy for people coming in this tent where you can wear whatever you want, and he's just glad to see them. And this is something, whereas other ministers, or clear examples, some ministers, especially over in the south of the city, they wouldn't allow people into their churches that weren't properly dressed. Of course, whilst the tent meetings proved successful, central to Montgomery, I should actually say, and as much as the tent meetings have proved successful, should make the point that it's quite disappointing that they're not actually remembered as well as it should be. Everybody was on about the mission building, but the tent meetings were, they're arguably one of the best examples I've actually seen of evangelism in Belfast. I didn't say Ireland at this time. But whilst they proved very successful, what Montgomery really wanted was the mission buildings up and running in order to offer Christian philanthropy, as he saw it. The architect who was appointed to design the mission buildings was a gentleman by the name of William, it's either Room or Rom, I always pronounce it Room, but I think I've heard others say Rom. And whilst this talk is primarily about Henry Montgomery, this figure is equally interesting, and if he's ever had time, I'd encourage you to try and search him up. He was, but he wasn't your normal architect. He was a professional architect. He had settled his exams, but he was also an evangelical foreign missionary. He was interested in foreign mission. And there's these great stories of him later on in life. He went across Africa on a bicycle, preaching the word of God. He climbed Kilimanjaro, and he left the Bible in a cave. And there's these great stories where he tells about, he said he was the first white man going into some areas in Africa, and he says he comes across cannibals and all. It's great stuff. So he's quite an important figure, and it shows that once again, the people that were committed to this project, they're not just, these are people that are specifically saying, let's get something done here in the Shankill. According to his original plans, these are rooms or room, whatever you want to call them, there was going to be 7 departments in the mission, with the central piece of the premises being a large semicircular assembly hall, which would be capable of seating 2,000 people. That's a lot of people, for a church setting or a mission setting. Some churches at this time couldn't have held that. The second department would be a medical mission on the ground floor. This would include a large waiting hall that would be capable of seating approximately 200 people, a doctor's consulting room, a dispensary and dressing rooms. The idea was there would also be a nurse available. The third section was quite innovative because there would be the business or money-making side of the premises with 4 shops that would be on either side of where the mission hall would be. So the idea would be that you would use the top stories, but you would rent out the ground floor, so you'd be making money. And you might remember I said earlier about Montgomery, the idea that he didn't start off as a minister, he went into business for a time. So you're getting this idea, which is someone that's, you could argue no one else could do this, but he's really thinking about what he wants for this mission building. And he's also aware that it has to make money. The 4th department, there would be a soup kitchen, stuff like this. The 5th department, there would be halls for capable of accommodating about 250 people. You could use this for classrooms. The 2nd floor would be a social and recreational department for a general parlour, a men's reading room, a library, a boys' club, a girls' club, ladies' private sitting room. The final department was fascinating. His idea, he wanted to build a residential training home at the very top. As Montgomery said, many missionary candidates from Belfast are obliged to go for training to Glasgow, Edinburgh and London and elsewhere, and thus give their services and strength to work amongst the needy in these cities. His idea was that he would be able to accommodate 20 missionary students every year, and he would train them up. So once again, he's thinking, yes, I want to sort out the problem in the Shankill, but he's also planning for Belfast broadly. He's trying to build up a missionary school here. The plans for the mission building show that Montgomery had a vision for the Shankill Road mission, which was both ambitious and pioneering. As I say, no one else was doing this in Belfast. Previously, evangelical mission work in Belfast had been solely concerned with preaching the gospel and saving the individual. This was the way that ministers were all. It was about saving. If you save the soul, you save the individual. However, Montgomery wanted to promote individual conversion. Yes, you're still going out evangelicalism. The idea is still to bring them to the Lord, whilst also striving to deal with the material problems that people face. It could be argued, or I would argue that he envisioned the institution as being a type of social centre where all needs could be dealt with. Unfortunately, due to financial, and I suppose this is the big regret about it, unfortunately due to financial constraints, when the mission buildings opened in November 1898, they were actually opened by the Lord Mayor. Once again, this is telling you a bit of an idea about this. This is the days when the Lord Mayor is a big deal. Not that I'm saying they're not these days, maybe. Well, I don't know, I'll leave that for another day. Unfortunately, due to financial constraints, the medical and the residential department had to be scrapped. Now, I would argue these were the two big ideas. The medical mission, the idea you're going into a mission place and there's a doctor there, a nurse, you're being treated, because a lot of these people were ill. And obviously the residential department, the great idea, the Shankill Road will be the centre of Belfast for missionary endeavour. But as I say, finance was a big obstacle from the start. And whenever he first proposed the idea in 1896, the original estimate was £10,000. The company that did the work was McLaughlin and Harvey, although the company put in tenders, and theirs was the cheapest at just over £13,500. But how to raise this money? The key point here is the Presbyterian Church, they had nothing to do with this. This was all in Montgomery's own back. The Presbyterian Church did not invest any money in this. They actually didn't even recognise it until, I think it was, someone can correct me, was it 1907 when it was made a congregation? 1902 or 1907?
No, it was 1912 it made a congregation.
We'll not argue over it. Go ahead.
1912, yeah.
1912.
Right. It was 1912 and it was made a congregation. So, well, there you are. That shows in itself, it was longer than I thought. It shows quite clearly that up until that point, the Shankill Road mission was not recognised at all by the Presbyterian Church. So how did they raise the money? Well, this is something I had problems with in research. There's only two. I see £1,000 was raised by Albert Street congregation, his own congregation. That was off their own backs, and they're taking it out of their own church, £1,000. Another £1,000 was donated from Forrester Green. I don't know if anybody would be aware of him. He was the tea merchant, and then he built the church. Yeah. So and he raised the. But aside from that, I don't know where the rest of the money came from. Obviously, it took a lot of individual donations, but there was massive problems. They were paying this off years later. But I think at the end of the day, it is testament to Montgomery's success that he still managed to get the work done. There's issues about, where he's saying to Albert Street, let's pray today that we can get the roof on, stuff like that. But in spite of this, the mission buildings were still opened in November 1898, and the work they kind of got onto, I would like to kind of finish up by kind of discussing. Firstly, the opening of the mission buildings allowed for Montgomery and his helpers to provide a wide-ranging calendar of activities. For example, on Monday evenings they would have had Bible classes, and they had room for the Scout movement, the BB. Essentially the buildings were well used during the week. They also put an emphasis upon the Sunday schools. You had the Templar Society's temperance issue. Obviously, the idea, the whole idea of the mission was about drink, so he was keen to get them in and stop them drinking. Secondly, every year the mission provided a Christmas supper to the poor and needy. For example, the annual report for the year 1900 stated that approximately 2,500 of the very poorest had received a substantive meal during the Christmas and New Year period. It was stated that it is one of the saddest sights to look into the faces of one of the Christmas audiences. They are kindly treated, well fed, and earnestly spoken to about a better life. This was quite a remarkable thing they were doing every Christmas Eve, and I think also New Year's Eve. They would have brought as many people in as possible, and they would have got something to eat, and they would have given them a food package before they left, with even a bit of bread and what else, a bit of drop of milk. So unfortunately, just due to money, they can only do that once a year. So it was really, Thirdly, another important development in the work of the mission, and you'll all be aware this, was the holidays to the seaside. I've mentioned this, so really this was only starting out in my period. I looked up to about 1912. I read a great, like Albert Hazlitt's wee book, Memories of the Shankill, where he tells a great story about his trip down to the holiday homes. That started much later. What Montgomery was able to do in these days, the early days, was for the very needy, mainly children, to taking them down to Bangor for the day. But even then, the big plan that would come for the mission, the idea of the holiday homes, that all came much later, but it shows it started somewhere. These examples of the mission's work show clearly that it was reaching the non-church-going masses in a meaningful and effective way. The 1904 annual report, I'll quote you because it's one of the best, it's the best report I've actually ever read. from them, and it just sums up exactly what the mission was all about in these days. The Shankill Road mission seeks to deal with a man as a whole. If it finds him hungry, it feeds him. If he requires clothing, it seeks as far as its means will permit to provide them. If he requires a situation, many attempts are made to secure such. If he or his child is puny and friend of illness, it provides either or both with a week or fortnight in the fresh country air. It seeks also to instruct his mind and give him a taste for wholesome and helpful reading. You know, it's essentially the manifesto of what the mission is all about. Finally, the significance of Montgomery and the Shankill Road mission, I think, can be placed within the context of what happened next in terms of how the Presbyterian Church, and more broadly churches across Ireland, reacted to what was going on. In 1903, the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church set up a committee to examine it was a committee entitled The Work of the Church in Industrial Centres, and its objective was to inquire into the relation of the Church and of individual congregations to the non-church-going families in our industrial centres of population. Essentially, it was listening to what Montgomery had said, and it was, you could argue, maybe a bit too late, but it was getting on with the business. And then in 1904, it came back with a report saying more needs to be done. In 1907, there was a further report, in 1907 at the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church, they then set up the first Committee on Social Service, and Montgomery was actually a member of this. So it took until 1907 was the first time that the Presbyterian Church really acknowledged the importance of social service. In terms of Montgomery, and trying to assess how far the Presbyterian Church rewarded him for his efforts, I think you would have to look to the centenary year, 1912. Because he was promoted he was elected the moderator of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church, and in that year, obviously we had the Ulster Covenant, and he was one of the first signatures after the Unionist leadership, as the leader of the church, and he signed it down in the City Hall. So clearly that was his reward, and that was, I think, an acknowledgement of his work. And obviously, of course, as I think Jim rightly pointed out, whenever that it actually became a congregation as well, that was also, saying that you're quite correct there. In conclusion, I would like to, I've shown that, I hope I've shown that Henry Montgomery was an important figure in terms of home mission work in late Victorian and Edwardian Belfast. And I think the best testament to his legacy would probably be the report of his funeral in the newsletter when he died, and when he passed away in February 1943. And I think it says a lot about how much esteem he was held by the Shankill Road people. This was just a brief point that was made in the newsletter. Many people lined the streets in the area where Dr. Montgomery had spent a long life of devoted service. Blinds were drawn, doors of business premises were shut, and there was other evidences of the deep respect in which citizens, without distinction of creed, held the memory of the man who had long ministered to their spiritual and temporal needs. Essentially, the Shankill Road can be a standstill for the man that had helped them. And I think that says a lot about it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.